Thank you. I hope you had a good break. I hope you are sufficiently caffeinated. Rumor has it that one of the things that you need to get good policy through, or maybe even bad policy through, but to get any policy through, is leadership. So I think it is appropriate that we have our final session, actually not quite our final session, because Andrew Potter is going to be coming up after this session as a rapporteur, but our final session before Andrew, to talk about leadership. So this panel has two outstanding leaders to talk about how they have made their way through what I like to call the policy minefields. If you are a leader, so we have a former Premier of Alberta, we have a former Prime Minister of Canada, both exceptional leaders, both have been through the policy minefields, and that's what we're going to talk about. How do you lead through the policy minefields? And so what we're going to do, I've asked each of them to give us all one example of a policy initiative that was harder than they expected it to be, and why, and to tell us that story. And then we're going to talk about that. So both of them are going to give us an example of something that was harder than they expected, and then we're going to talk about a policy initiative from each that was easier than they expected, and why. Hopefully we'll draw out some lessons. Then we'll see where that takes us, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the floor. So that's where we're going. We're going to start with Rachel Notley. I just want to say, I'm born and raised in Edmonton. And when I was about the age to start voting, there was a young, dynamite Alberta politician, and his name was Grant Notley. And he was the leader of the NDP in Alberta. And he unfortunately died early in 1984 or 5 in a plane crash. And when Rachel Notley came on the scene politically, 30 years later, 25 years later, something like that, I've never been very good at math, I thought it was a cool thing. And watching Rachel Notley over the past few years has been, for me, super impressive. To watch her negotiate through those policy minefields. Paul Martin was a pretty amazing finance minister, and then he was a pretty impressive prime minister, and all of that for several years, and I can't remember how many years. But watching him negotiate through the policy minefields was pretty impressive. So I think these two individuals have some great lessons for us. So I'd like to kick it off. I'm going to start with Rachel, and we're going to start with Rachel Notley's example of a policy initiative that was harder than she expected it to be, and why. Tell us the story, and let's see where that takes us.
All right, I will try to do this. I just have my little note paper here to sort of try to organize my thoughts, and please don't hesitate to tell me when I go on for too long, because I have a tendency to do that. But, you know, obviously during our government there was a number of different complex and challenging issues that we faced. We will say we did not win the lottery of, or the Russian roulette of good things happening during the term of our government. But the one that I want to talk a little bit about is the climate leadership plan, because there's already been, of course, some conversation about it already. And so it wasn't necessarily harder than we expected, but it was hard. And we've already had some conversation about, you know, whether it was, whether the legacy of it was a success, the example of it maybe serves as some form of success. But we do know, of course, that many pieces of it have been canceled by our successor government. So what were some of the things that made it challenging for us? I kind of, in doing that, I sort of identified 4 features. One was the context in which our climate leadership plan was introduced, the politics that were in play both after our climate leadership plan was introduced, some of the external events that we hadn't anticipated that impacted the success of the CLP, and then finally the complexity of the plan itself. And all four of those things made it more of a challenge. So to give you a bit of background, I mean, we were elected in May of 2015. We ran on a plan to introduce a meaningful effective climate leadership strategy to the province of Alberta. And so we very quickly created a discussion document. We set up a panel. We brought in Andrew Leach. We worked with a multiplicity of stakeholders throughout the process. So there was a plan that was developed, but throughout it all, we were also speaking with stakeholders, both the NGOs as well as the leaders in the oil and gas industry and others. And we put together a plan, actually, in hindsight, in incredible amount of speed. And the Ecofiscal Commission, of course, had already been doing work, and so we had a lot of work to draw on. And we introduced the plan in November of 2015, and in January of 2017, our tax came into effect. And so that's how it rolled out. But the context within which we did this, of course, was that Alberta was going through arguably what was the biggest and most damaging recession in a generation, maybe multiple generations. And in fact, things went from bad to worse, such that by 2016, we'd had 150 to 200,000 people lose their jobs, and the economy was in very, very bad shape. So that was the context which made the policy much more difficult to introduce. And so then, of course, the politics that were overlaid, that overlaid that, of course, was that having I think it's arguable, surprised a few people by winning government from a conservative group of folks who'd been around for 44 years. There was an exceptionally intense reaction in the political world, and so we were governing in a highly politicized setting. Very, very early on, and the temperature just turned up throughout the term of our government. So far more than I think most governments experience in many cases, and of course we were also, our opposition was very good at playing wedge politics and very good at getting their message across. And so this plan then became politicized in an incredible way. And then we had external events, and we had to deal with the fact that we had a federal government that although we worked together with them on many fronts, and they brought in a federal climate change plan and all that kind of stuff, they also brought in C69, they brought in C48, they made themselves a target in a number of other ways, and people started to confound progress on climate change with C69 and C48, and there was just a whole bunch of anger that was, I think, disingenuously, in my view, put together with these issues and then laid on top of the issue of the carbon pricing scheme, and in particular the carbon tax. And that happened, and then we had the courts do what they do such a lovely way and canceled our pipeline, which was not helpful, and nobody expected it to happen. And then we also had new governments, including my great friends and colleagues in BC, spend about 6 months playing around with being far more oppositional than they really ever had the jurisdiction to be, but it took a while for them to figure that out. And so these things all happened, and it made it very complex. And then, in fact, probably the biggest challenge is that it was a very complex policy. massive amounts of stakeholders, huge unintended consequences, or intended consequences, but different consequences in different settings. And people talked in the last panel about the need to have sector by sector understanding of the impact of carbon pricing and people's lives. What were the impact on people's lives? Andrew talked about the guy who used to work in the coal industry, and so it was a very big project. And it was not one where you see the results of it within a 4-year election cycle. And that's the other thing, that navigating these things, it's hard to do when you're operating within election cycles in a highly politicized, polarized environment. So those are the challenges. I think there are still some wins from it, and this will be the last thing I say about this, and we can open it up, is I was saying to a few folks last night that, when I look back at the history of Medicare, it took a historic saint-like figure who was an elected official for 44 years. It took 20 years in government, 5 consecutive elections, 2 premiers, 2 prime ministers, 3 political parties, and over 20 years to make Medicare a thing. So I see what we did with the CLP as part of history, which is not yet, that we're still writing, and that it will get there eventually.
So in the first 2 panels this morning, we heard about being patient, right? Having a good idea and having the persistence to not only be there, be ready when the window opens, but also to keep pushing on it. So persistence. Paul Martin, does this have any questions, have any thoughts for Rachel? Does it create traumatic memories for you, for example, about anything you might have done professionally?
All I can say, Rachel, welcome to Quebec.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I've got a question, which is the economic context in Alberta at the time was, the world price of oil fell seriously in 2014. Mm-hmm. So that's the economic context that you're talking about. So major downturn in that sector, and that sector is large in the economy. How did you resist the argument that you must have heard 150 times, which is, if you're going to do this in terms of climate policy, just now's not the time. Wait until the good times return. You must have heard that. How do you resist that argument? Or how did you resist that argument?
Well, I think that the other way to look at it was to see what was happening in the oil and gas industry, and to see what happened with respect to prices, as well as the restructuring of the oil and gas industry as a signal, which frankly people should have seen sometime before that happened, that we had no time to waste to both invest and support overall economic diversification of our energy sector, and also efforts to take carbon out of the barrel. And that as the industry was confronting the kinds of challenges that it was and is, that if there was going to be a future for the industry, it needed itself to do the hard work of addressing climate change issues. And in fact, there were leaders in oil and gas who themselves they answered that question for our government as well as we answered it, because they saw that what was coming, and that they had an obligation to find better ways to do things. And so this was about, in some ways, providing a platform to support those forward-thinking leaders, so that they were not, jeopardizing their competitiveness against those who just want to take everything they could this moment, and they'd worry about tomorrow. So I think there was a way to argue it that in fact the change highlighted and emphasizes the need for us to take action.
Could you just give us a 1-minute précis, I suppose, about the coalition that you had to build? Because on the day that you announced that policy, November 21st, 2015, you had a group of very unusual suspects on the stage with you. So who were they and how did you get that together?
Well, I mean, I think to give credit where it's due, many of them were already meeting with each other. And so there were leaders within civil society, both from the environmental side of things, from the NGOs, as well as from oil and gas and other industry leaders who were already talking and looking at ways in which they could build consensus between themselves in order to make progress, and while not, sort of fighting each other to a draw where nobody was left standing. And so what we were able to do then was, I think, simply to go into that room, figuratively, and say, listen, we have the levers of power, we have the levers of legislative effect, and so therefore we'd like to work with all of you to come up with a plan that was, so they were there together. And then I think what happened was, because they knew we were serious and we were going to move forward and we were not going to be particularly slow about making real change, I think that accelerated the quality and depth and breadth of their discussions with each other. So that helped. Now, it didn't hold together that well, I will say. I mean, some have walked away from it to some degree since then, but some are still there even to this day, continuing to advocate for this idea that we cannot pit economic progress and non-renewable energy against environmental protection and action. Because if we approach it that way, given the nature of our economy in this country, we will fail. Everybody's going to fail, both economically and environmentally.
Okay, let's bring it back to Paul Martin. And I think your example of a hard policy initiative, but important, takes place in the mid-1990s.
Yes, it does, and it has everything. It has everything to do with the deficit. The deficit is a standard problem for any government all the time. It's a standard problem for governments today. The big difference between today and when I became finance minister was that not only did Canada have a deficit problem that had been lying there for a long time, but our debt ratio was god-awful. And it was that debt ratio that really made the difference. And what surprised me when I became finance minister was the degree to which the deficit had become an urgent issue. It was an issue, but the level of pain. I mean, we all talk about the famous Wall Street Journal writing an article that Canada was a third world country, but I had to bring in my first budget within 35 days of becoming finance minister. I thought it was a pretty good a budget. It went well with Canadians, laid an egg with the markets, and I went across the major markets of the world and really found out the position that Canada found itself in. And what had really happened was that the Italians primarily and Greece had made such a hash of dealing with their issues, their financial issues, and there were massive demonstrations in the streets, and there were all of this kind of thing. And countries that had the same debt ratio as we did with the deficit were really taking it in the ear, and that's what it would. We were being blamed. We were really having to carry this weight because the situation in Europe was so bad and the markets were just writing us off. And what really was the most frightening thing as far as I was concerned, and this is the one that I took the deficit fight to Canadians on the basis, it was not simply the quality of your balance sheet, but it was really what it was going to do to your social programs, because governments borrow for social programs. But if they can't borrow for the social programs, then that affects your health care, it affects your educational institutions. And our problem was that we were going to find ourselves, the minute that there was some kind of a financial crisis, in a position where we could not borrow. And I don't think anybody understood that to the extent that that I did. The one thing that helped me as we put the budget together, but some of you may remember, there are elderly people like Mel Capp, who was part of this, would remember it. But there was the Mexican peso crisis. The Mexican peso crisis occurred, and every country that had a bad balance sheet, beginning with Canada, took it in a year. And so we suddenly found ourselves where we could be seeing our interest rates going out of control. And there is no worse, deficits have their qualities and their problems. There is no worse deficit than a deficit that is being caused by rising interest rates, which are doing nothing for the country, as opposed to deficits which occur because you're spending money on either building infrastructure or spending it in social policy. So the problem that I had to face then was a problem that I knew I had to deal with, but I did not realize, to be honest, that I had to deal with it right away. That there was no waiting. I thought I could do as previous governments had done, sort of taken time and to build up the public support. The other thing that I recognized, having watched the Italians and the Greeks make a hash of it, was that there were a number of things that you could not do. One of them is you couldn't approach it in little chunks. You could not go to your people and say to them, okay, I'm going to protect your education, I'm going to protect your health care, and I'm going to make this minor cut in spending. And then next year I'll come back and say, well, I guess I didn't make enough, I'm going to make another major cut. Because what happens if you go to a parent and you said to that parent, I'm going to essentially cut a little bit, it's going to affect your child's school, but don't worry about it, I'm going to settle the deficit. And then next year you go back to them and say, oh, guess what? I wrecked your kid's school, but now I'm going to wreck something else because I didn't do enough. So the fact of the matter was that there was no more patience out there for not dealing with these issues. And so we had to do it. And we did. And then my problem became, well, first of all, my problem was convincing Canadians. And I'll tell you, that was a lot easier than what you thought, because I wasn't out there talking about having a prettier balance sheet. I was talking about protecting our healthcare system. I was talking about protecting our education system. And Canadians understood that. And that while they didn't like the idea that you were going to even have to cut transfers to the provinces for those very things, they understood that, in fact, if this is what you had to do to protect them, as long as you came back to us at some point making it up. One of the things that happened when I became Prime Minister is I brought in the largest healthcare budget in Canadian history at a time when a lot of people said you don't have to do this. But this was payback time. This was payback time. We had cut the living heck out of it, and we were going to pay it back. So fundamentally, it came on us much more quickly than I thought, but Canadians rose to the challenge. And they rose to the challenge because they understood that what they were protecting were their social programs. And so there was a little battle between some conservatives and then more enlightened people here in the last panel discussion. So, but let me just tell you, you got that. It took them a while. I got. I believe actually that center-left governments are going to be more conscious of the need for a sound balance sheet and good financial statements because the government's more important to them. And they cannot afford. And I'm told, and the history has borne this out, one of the strongest finance ministers in Canadian history was Tommy Douglas's finance minister. And that was for that very reason. And I'm not saying this because you're here, ma'am. In fact,
but it helps.
I wish I didn't have to say it, but but the fact of the matter is that it is a government that understands the importance of a sound balance sheet to fund the programs that people need to build a strong economy. And but we pulled it off.
Okay, so for those people who consider themselves young in the audience and you don't remember your statistics on federal debt and deficits, In 1992-1993, the federal debt to GDP ratio was 68%. Today it is 31%. The deficit, the annual deficit back then was 6% of GDP. Today it is less than 1%. So the debt problem that Paul Martin faced and the deficit problem that Paul Martin faced was way bigger than anything the finance minister faces today. So I've got two questions. One is, in the fiscal adjustments you made from the 95 budget on, it's roughly, I seem to recall, something like a 7-to-1 ratio, is that most of the 7 times in dollar value the cuts were on spending and 1 for an increase in revenue. Maybe it was 6-to-1, but it was something in that ballpark. And you introduced something called program review, which was to completely review all government spending. And you may or may not be delighted to know that in a course that I teach in Canada's #1 MPP program, that was for you, Nance. My favorite Paul Martin quote is up there in the middle of the screen. And the Paul Martin quote comes from the days of program review. And the Paul Martin quote is, "Government should only do what only government can do." And we stare at that for a while, and then we talk about what that means. Could you give us a sense about the logic behind your program review and how that quote, if indeed you agreed that that was your quote, because it was, how that all worked out?
Well, it worked out well, but the other way of looking at that quote, and I want to come back to program review in a minute, but the other way is to say that there is so much that only government can do, that government should focus on doing that. You can do more in government, and I've said this before, you can do more in government in 5 minutes than you can do in 5 months outside of government. And for government to basically spend its time on doing things that other people can do as well is a mistake. Because what government can do is essentially knit together the muscles of the country. And if it doesn't do it, then the country will not do well. Now on program review, I brought in, program review was a very good idea. We brought it in fact, when we were doing the party platform. But program review then took on another role. You got to understand something. When with the Department of Finance, what we would do, we went through everybody's budget. It was an arithmetic exercise when we were preparing the big budget. And then I would sit down with the individual minister. David Dodge would go in and sit down with the departmental people and get all that. But I would sit down with the minister and tell him that, guess what? You know, whatever the heck he was running was going to be half as big the next year, and that's what had to happen. And most of my colleagues thought I was crazy, didn't they, Erwin? But any event, so I had to make that happen. Program review was, because the Minister of Finance had all of this power to basically savage a government department, like in that way, program review was there had to be an appeal. And the appeal body was, in fact, program review. And it was run by Marcel Massé, who essentially the minister would go in front and say, this is what we're doing, and Martin is basically just ruined my life by taking all of this. You've got to give me some of it back. And the rule that I had set was, to program review, is you can, if you think I've cut a minister by too much, you can reimburse him. You can say, you can give him back whatever the heck it is that you think he needs, but you've got to take it from somebody else. Which meant, of course, that nobody was good. Martin was hated enough that he wasn't going to get hated, so that in fact they never did it. Program review functioned in that way, and there was only one minister. There was only one minister that essentially beat us. I don't know how many of you knew Herb Gray. Herb Gray was from my hometown. I knew him well. Herb Gray was absolutely beloved of everybody in the caucus, certainly in cabinet. He had more experience than anyone else. And Herb Gray was in charge of CSIS. And so you had to go, if you were doing program review, you had to go and you had to essentially say, this is what we're doing, this is what I'm going to cut, this is what I'm going to try to protect. Herb Gray went in and said, you can't cut me, but I can't tell you what I'm doing. And of course they said, yeah. Why? National security. So they finally called me. They said, we can't do anything about it. We just can't get them to tell us what it is. Keep saying national security. So finally I had a meeting of all of the departmental, all the finance officials around the table. And I said, I took the phone call where they said, we just can't, you've lost, Herb's beaten you. And I put the phone down and I just said to them, you know, I'm going to have to call Herb and tell him that he's won. And then one of the guys on my staff pointed to the little thing on the roof there, you know, that thing, and he said, he already knows. And that was it.
Okay. So we'll come back and talk about surveillance techniques. Okay, so we're moving back. We're moving back to Rachel Notley. So it's time to talk, and I want to come back to external events actually after a while, but let's go back to Rachel Notley for your example of an easier than expected policy.
Well, you know, it's interesting to flow a little bit from this issue of deficit reduction, and it is true, something that New Democrats typically run on is the fact that even with me having been in government during the sort of sudden disappearance of 25% of our revenue in almost a year, I think we still have the best records in terms of overall fiscal management. But that being said, what I will say is that just to put some context on it, because of course this is something that is front and center in our conversation in Alberta right now, is this issue of debt or deficit elimination and debt reduction. Notwithstanding the fact that that was not actually front and center in the campaign last spring. But to put it in context, so Paul was confronted with a 68% debt to GDP ratio. The current federal government is dealing with about a 30% debt to GDP ratio. Alberta may have inched over 10% at this point. It's about 11 or 12%. So it's important to put that in context, because you can sometimes be really stupid about these things too. And so an example would be, and I apologize because I'm still very actively in electoral politics, I'm perhaps a little bit more politicized and weaponized than those who have retired. So I apologize for using the word stupid, but nonetheless.
Are you not still planning to come back?
I was up until now.
No, by all means, come back. You're not stupid. No. I'm just. But there, a member of the executive council of the people who are currently governing our party right now walked into the Chamber of Commerce a short time ago and said to them that the matter of economic diversification in the province of Alberta is a, quote, long-term luxury. And that what we needed to do in the short and medium term was eliminate the deficit and the debt. And I would suggest that that's rather short-sighted, but also to point out, of course, that we had in fact we'd had a path to balance, we were hitting our targets, we were going to balance the budget, and we had in fact exceeded our targets by $2 billion. I have to say all this before I talk about my easy plan, because otherwise it'll sound like I'm completely tone deaf. But so we always had our eye on responsible fiscal management, and I believe we actually performed in that regard. But as New Democrat, of course, one of the things that we always focus on is the issue of equality and equality of opportunity and the elimination of poverty. And so we did a number of things without really spending a lot of time analyzing exactly what our performance measures would be and all that kind of thing, but rather just because we've been talking about it for so long in our circles and believed very truly that it was the right thing to do. So we paired with the federal government's child tax credit. We expanded it beyond the terms that the federal government had put in place. We got rid of payday loan companies. We funded school nutrition. We got rid of school fees. We introduced a minimum wage, which came into effect in 2018, even as the restaurant industry was growing and retail sales were growing and yada, yada, yada. We did these things, and what we discovered in 2018, and one stat which I only learned a few weeks ago, was first of all that we went from having 80,000 children in Alberta living in poverty to 40,000 children in Alberta living in poverty. So we cut child poverty in half. And so we hadn't really been tracking it, and just one day someone said, oh, by the way, there's 40,000 fewer children who are hungry right now. So that was kind of a big deal. And the other thing was that in Calgary, which was sort of the epicenter of the recession, where we had the most struggles, the most challenges with respect to people losing their jobs, and you know, the downtown towers, a third of them were empty, and folks were really struggling, and the economy was, and still is, very slow in Calgary. But between 2015 and 2018, we actually dropped the number of people in Calgary living in poverty by 27%. So, biggest recession in a generation, but we pulled people out of poverty at the same time, at one of the most difficult times. And so what that underlined for me is that if there's a political will to do these things, you can do that. And this happened at a time when, in fact, in 2018-19, we exceeded our deficit reduction target by almost $2 billion. So we had proposed that we would have about an $8.2 billion deficit, and we, sorry, not 2 billion, 1.3, and we brought in a $6.7 billion deficit instead, and we were tracking to get it down to zero by 2023. But the point being is, so we could do that, we could reduce spending, and we could still eliminate poverty for a lot of people. And then, of course, the minimum wage brought folks to within 8% of a living wage. And that was, I'm told, a historically low gap anywhere in the country. So
Good.
That was cool.
Thoughts on that? Because you talked about deficit reduction to save social programs.
Yeah.
These kinds of social programs are the ones that were being introduced.
They are. I guess the question I'd ask, interestingly enough, the federal government is responsible for Indigenous people on reserve. Mm-hmm. The responsibility off reserve is the responsibility of the provinces. How do you think Alberta did?
With respect to on reserve?
Off reserve.
Well, all of these programs impact Indigenous people off reserve, and so I think it did help. We also invested in specific Indigenous affordable housing. We did a whole bunch of stuff through the Climate Leadership Plan to open up business opportunities both on and off. Honestly, we had too close to the last election to put it into effect, but we had essentially declared that we had it with the off-reserve, on-reserve distinction, and that we were going to actually fund child protection as per what Cindy Blackstock had been begging for, and we were just going to go back to the federal government and try to get the money back because we couldn't tolerate the consequences of the gap any further. Obviously, and then we also funded, we put about, on a per capita basis, almost 10 times the money that the federal government put in for water, to get clean water to reserves. So we'd also put that money in as well. So we were making progress, but, you know, I mean, let's be honest, true reconciliation, no government's going to do that in a 4-year term. That's a generational, multi-generational commitment that every government, regardless of its partisanship, needs to commit to and then execute.
Did you need to build the same sort of coalition?
Could I just say something? One of the things that those of us who are involved with Indigenous peoples, the business community, the two business communities that understand Indigenous peoples and are really prepared to work with them the best are, in my opinion, the oil and gas industry and the mining industry compared to any others. And I think that's something, that should be recognized.
Mm-hmm. No, I think so, and I'll tell you something. This is something where we actually, very rare that this happens, but Jason Kenney and I actually agree. The Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, that was actually something that we were looking at doing as well. I wouldn't necessarily have structured that way. I mean, we're currently just inviting them to go into debt, but nonetheless, it is this idea of paving the way for First Nations and Indigenous groups to get equity interest in the pipeline and any other energy products, I think is good. It's a good idea, and so we were in support of that policy initiative by the
On the poverty
Conservatives.
reduction programs, and you listed a number of them, did you have to build a coalition in the same way that you built for the climate policy? Or is it a different type of issue?
You know, it's interesting. It depends which one you talk about. So we did. People here probably wouldn't be aware, but I was talking with a couple of folks about it. You know, our poverty reduction involved both income support changes as well as labor changes, minimum wage, and other labor changes. Very early on in our term, we did what we thought was an obvious move, which was to finally make Alberta be the last province in the country to provide health and safety rights and workers' compensation rights to farm workers. And it was the most poorly handled political file. It's a case study in how not to do something that you think is the right thing. And so moving forward then, with the minimum wage, with the changes to the other changes we made in labor standards, as well as with respect to income support, we were very intentional about not only bringing as many people on side as we could in advance, but making sure they were there for the announcements, and we're prepared to continue that conversation, supporting that initiative after it was introduced. And so that's why, you know, we had obvious opponents to the minimum wage, but we actually had a number of very strong proponents to the minimum wage, and then we also had the ultimate economic performance that as well as the subsequent anti-poverty measures that supported it. But so we thought it would be harder than it was. And we certainly never saw support for the $15 an hour minimum wage go below 60% in Alberta. As we talked about it, moved towards it, implemented it, we maintained a pretty strong level of support for it.
Okay, so you both touched on some of what you said and some of what Paul asked about Indigenous. Back to Paul Martin for your example of something that was easier than you expected, which I think dates from the early 2000s.
Well, in fact, this was the Kelowna Accord. Some of you, the Kelowna Accord was an accord that we brought in. It was my first action as Prime Minister, and what it was essentially was an agreement between the federal government, the provinces, and the First Nations communities, the Inuit communities, and the Métis communities, to essentially deal with the massive discrimination of funding in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, and the wide range. And so, what happened, Chris, is that I had this idea very clearly in my mind, and so what we did, we called the provinces, all of whom were interested. I then spoke to Phil Fontaine, who some of you may know he was the Grand Chief at that time of the Assembly, and then we brought in the heads of the other organizations and everything else. And my biggest fear was all of a sudden I've got all of these Indigenous governments, and then I got the provinces, now forgive me, ma'am, but who are not all that easy to deal with, and all of a sudden we're going to have all of this bunch around the table. How in God's name are we ever going to put this together? How are we going to make it work? And I really put this out to you for those of you who have had the opportunity to deal with Indigenous people, because Phil Fontaine came up with a very good idea. He basically said, let us set the agenda. You called this meeting to deal with us. Don't impose the agenda. Don't consult among yourselves. let us set the agenda as to what we think that this meeting should be able to deliver. And then he said something else, which is, again, for people who have to deal with it. He also said, you're going to set up, we said, fine, you can set the agenda, then we'll set up the tables that are going to negotiate the accord. And at which point he said, you've got to allow these tables to break, let's say once a month for a week. Because what happens, inevitably we sit down with you guys, we make a deal with you, we agree, our people don't know about it, and then all of a sudden we've got to go back and essentially sell them on a deal that they have not been part of. And what we want, and I think this is a real lesson, what we want to do is to be able to sit and negotiate with you, and then once a month go back to our communities and tell them where we are in this negotiation, and get them to say, okay, yeah, keep going that way, or don't keep going that way. And the net result of what Phil Fontaine had suggested, and the way in which we operated, was that 18 months later, around that table, all of them, the federal cabinet ministers, provincial cabinet ministers, provincial leaders, territorial leaders, with the Indigenous leaders, agreed on the Kelowna Accord. It was a historical moment. And Jim Prentice, who was there on behalf of the Conservative Party, essentially said this is one of the best days of his life. And so it was a tremendously successful thing. And at the same time, the Kelowna Accord, Ralph Goodale, because by this time we were, as you had said, out of deficit, put $5 billion on the table. It was not booked in a budget, but it was booked in the surplus money that he was going to have, because we had it. That was one of the things we were starting to spend. I look at Mel Cap, he's not sure we like starting to spend. But the fact of the matter is, that was the Kelowna Accord. It was a tremendous success. And the other part of it was the apology, because the apology was also agreed to at the same time. And what Kelowna essentially was we apologize. And but it's not just a simple apology. We're going to make it up by putting this money into healthcare, education, and everything else. Now, unfortunately, there was after that, there was I stepped down from government, which is a euphemism for saying I lost the election. And unfortunately, fortunately, the apology went forward, but the government walked away from the Kelowna Accord. So that in putting together my plan as to how do you deal with it, I think I've got the perfect plan. The only thing that I missed is it's a good thing to win the next election, and that's what happened. But I think that the Kelowna Accord has established a precedent that sooner or later will have to be met.
Well, I mean, I think that's the issue, right? You have these long-term things, and the election cycles are hard. And when you look sort of historically at big things we've achieved in our democratic institutions, it's been in part because we've enjoyed multiple term governments that have been able to maintain the energy for some of these things over the election cycle. So that's the problem with coming up with some of these great things near the end of your cycle, is that they struggle to maintain engine.
Well, it's hard to tie the hands of subsequent governments. But if it's the Harper government that dismembered most or perhaps all of the Kelowna Accord, for the last 4 and a bit years, we've seen the Trudeau government doing a lot on this front, or at least talking a lot about doing a lot on this front. How much of Kelowna has been, has any part of it been sort of reassembled? Yes, it is being reassembled. And my own belief is that it will eventually appear. That's not, however, and I don't want to get into the political debate, but the tragedy is we lost a decade. That's where the problem lies. So it will come back, but losing a decade means 2 generations.
have been affected by it.
Harold Macmillan in the UK was once asked about the challenges of leadership and politics. And he gave the famous quote, "Events, dear boy, events." So I wanted to talk about the external events, because both of you made reference to external events. So Rachel, when you were talking about getting the climate policy through in Alberta, you talked about a few external events, but one of them was the BC government decided it didn't want a pipeline. And that was a bit of a challenge for Alberta. Paul, you talked about an external event, so that made your policy harder. You talked about an external event, which was the Mexican crisis in December 1994, which actually made your policy easier. It actually, so external events can work in both ways. Right? Not all external events are bad. Do you have other examples about where external events have played a serious role?
Well, I got one projected, but I'll go to defer to Rachel first.
Oh, great! Yeah, I'm trying to think about some of these other events. Okay, this is going to bug me now because I'm sure I'll come up with some great ones. Obviously, interestingly, in terms of Alberta, what goes on in the U.S. has a big impact as it relates to our ability to secure market access, so you're banking on a certain amount of takeaway capacity, and then you, for instance, have Line 3 and a relatively junior court, I believe, in Nebraska, that may have delayed that for a year. And so that, for instance, is an example of things. So there's, in Alberta, just to take my moment here to talk to folks who are not from Alberta, as much as I could go on a long time about the issue of separation and what responsible leadership under the current circumstances does or does not look like, I will try to avoid that. What I will say, though, is that there is a very real frustration that exists in the province of Alberta, because we seem to have, over the last few years, been confronted with barrier after barrier after barrier after barrier. So whether you're talking about the courts, whether you're talking about the positioning of the BC government for a time, whether you're looking at what's going on now with takeaway capacity south of the border, whether you're looking at international changes in the market which have big implications for Alberta, whether you're talking about decisions taken by other provinces and statements made, by people here in Quebec, for instance. When you add it all up, there's a level of frustration amongst a group of Albertans, and I won't describe them in a partisan way, who just want to roll up their sleeves and get back to work and get back the life that they were planning on having. And that's really all people really want, right? Is to work hard and have the life that they plan to have. And over the last 4 years, regardless of who was actually in government, there has been multiple external circumstances that seem to have all coalesced, and folks are frustrated. And now they're looking around for a path for a solution, and they're looking around for an answer. And I would argue that it doesn't actually behoove us to give them a simple or inaccurate answer, but whatever, answers are being thrown into the mix right now. But it is real, and it's, I think, important for all Canadians to get that, and also, of course, to understand that the Canadian economy is negatively impacted as a result too.
Yeah, I'd like to answer your
And then
question.
I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you a question on this about G20, but you give me yours
well, that's
first.
That's what I'm. We think alike.
Very good. Very good.
That really worries me. Some of the things that I've talked about, Kelowna, talking about the deficits, these are all things that happened 20 years ago. 20 years ago doesn't sound like a very long time ago, but think about 20 years from now, and this is a conversation that I have had with Chris. The fact of the matter is, in 20 years, China will be a more powerful economy. Not individual, we're not talking per capita wealth. We're talking about the power of population. China will be a more powerful nation. It's projected by everybody than the United States. Others project that India may be part of that and that the United States could even be third. I'm not sure about that second, but certainly on the first. Africa will have a population equivalent of 25% of the global population. And if they pull together the common market they're in the process of doing, that Africa will be a much more powerful, not nearly, a much more powerful continent than it is at the present time. What we're now seeing are countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Korea, growing, and there is every set of a prediction if Europe continues to stagnate, that in fact these Asian countries are going to be major economies. Now the question that I guess I would put to all of us is that the reason that we have the prosperity today that we have is that beginning really, at the end of the Second World War, when the Bretton Woods institutions were created, when the United Nations really began to take hold, what we began to see was a scheme of collective action led primarily by the United States, but which all of us were part of, that has given us probably the greatest period of prosperity over any time that we've had in recent history. And the question that we really got to ask ourselves is, are we going to maintain that? Now we are seeing this, and you made a reference to this, Chris, but we're seeing collective action, cooperation, United States walking away from the Paris Accord as an example, in not the same kind of cooperation that we had prior to 2008. And the real question we're going to say is if we aren't able to regain that level of cooperation before the world changes that I've just described, what models are we going to have? Are we going to start at the very beginning of building the kind of cooperation with all of these new powers coming along? Are we going to learn that whole thing, or are we going to essentially from now until for the next 20 years build collective action, build cooperation into what it is we're doing, so that when these countries become the powers that they are going to be, in fact the world will understand that a single country isn't going to stop climate change. A single country isn't going to stop disease crossing borders. A single country isn't going to save the oceans. And I think that is the biggest issue that we've got to face now, is how do we put together how do we put together a world that worked? The problem isn't globalization. Globalization is not a government choice. Globalization is a reality. And the issue is, how do we make it work? And right now, we're failing. And we've got to get back that momentum.
Okay, so since you have asked all of them a question, let's let them ask you some. So let's open it up to questions from the floor. We've got lots of time for questions from the floor. Please keep your questions pithy, and as they tried in the previous panel, we'll try to keep the answers pithy, and that way we can get more questions and answers in. So we've got a couple of microphones. Kunal's got a microphone, and Antonietta, okay. Please.
Thank you. I'll keep this short. So I would love to ask you both, actually. You talk a little bit about the incremental approach to policy making and policy planning. Can you explain it a little bit more in your two versions or your two experience? How did you deal with the politics and the pressure of the people and the expectations of the people and the reception of the population about policy and about politics in general? And how do you make those changes work? Is it the big steps or smaller steps?
Okay, so the pressure of the people, the perceptions, how do you make it work with the people? How do you sell your ideas to the people? That's all right?
Well,
You want to start?
Look, I mean, there are obviously many. You got to talk to them. You got to go out to them. I'll give you a very narrow answer to your question, but I'll tell you what is for a politician. I don't know if this is the same thing in provincial government, but for a politician to use parliamentary committees and that the parliamentary committees travel. I will give you an example in terms of how do you make it. When we were trying to take the deficit fight out to Canadians and tell them what we were going to have to do, what we did is that we moved the finance committee, went across the country, and city after city, and the debates took place. And all of a sudden, the debates, they were not the politicians saying that this is what you've got to do, but it was people from the community coming up and getting a lot of press. And a lot of social media at the end of it, when the social media saying, or perhaps actually social media came later, but basically going in and saying that when the battle came between those who would cut and those who wouldn't cut, everybody could see that at least this was not whimsical. Everybody could understand the importance of it. And we got huge press from those parliamentary committees. And that's just one method. It's not a very good answer to your question, but it is one method as to how you go out to people.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel?
Well, I think I could give 2 examples of sort of, how you sort of proceed with incremental policymaking. I mean, I think, again, going back to the Climate Leadership Plan, that in and of itself was structured to enable incremental policymaking because there was actually more work to be done. I mean, we announced it in November of 2015, and we were still rolling out big pieces of it 6 months before the election. And indeed, there was more work that was designed to be done after the election. So, so in and of itself, it was about a 5-year execution window. But above and beyond that, there were pieces of it that were amenable to going back to citizens to say, did we get it right? Or should we change it? Should we tweak it? And it was always designed for that. It was designed to be responsive to what was happening on the federal level, what was happening with respect to other provinces, what was happening in other international jurisdictions as it related to trade exposed components of the plan. And so it was always meant to be incremental in terms of, and evolving and somewhat responsive and organic. Another simpler example, which I think I mean, for money we couldn't do it longer, but it was both helpful and not helpful. Actually, one of the single biggest things I am most passionate about in public policy is childcare. It's not that people don't do rallies for childcare, but I actually think it is the most significant economic and social initiative that we could take as a country. And we have failed on it up to this point. And so during the term of our government, because we were very tight with funds, as I'd already mentioned, what we did was we introduced pilot projects. And so we introduced pilot projects, affordable childcare, $25 a day childcare. And everywhere we introduced it, it was beloved and everybody loved it and people were in tears. They were so passionate for having it. The problem is that we got used to, and we being my government machine or my campaigning machine, got used to talking about it as though we had done it. And I would be constantly, because I'm a little bit of a control freak, reaching into whichever department was writing press releases saying, would you stop talking about our childcare program and talk about our pilot projects and our first steps and blah, 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 because the last thing I want is for people to think that they've already got it because they won't care about it because 90% of people have no idea what it means. And how are we going to build support for it if they don't understand what they don't have? So I think it's arguable we moved too slow, but obviously we were rightfully constrained by our fiscal reality. But so you have to be careful not to be so incremental that you lose people in the middle of the story.
Okay, a question over here, I think.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is very broad, just for myself, but also fellow members of my cohort at the #1 public policy school in Canada. Is there, and this is for both panelists, is there something that you wish you had known before you entered public life that you wish you could go back and sort of tell your younger selves?
Okay, Rachel, you want to start?
Why do you keep starting with me on these things that you have to think about for a bit?
Okay, Paul, you want to start?
No, she's got a quicker mind than mine.
Okay, maybe next question. We'll let you think about this one.
Yeah. I would say that you should. There are certain things I would have moved faster on. In fact, that we get a little bit lost in, and this is going to be probably a discouraging thing for people interested in public policy to hear. But from a political point of view, we get a little lost if you're trying to be the Lisa Simpson of governance and you're trying to do everything right. We get a little lost in our own internal way of doing things, and we put our own limits. And I realize that if you want to make bold change, sometimes you just got to do it. And move a bit faster, not unlike what Paul was talking about in terms of some of his initiatives. So there are some things that I would have moved a bit faster on.
I think probably I wish, if you're asking me, I wish I had understood Indigenous Canada far better. What happened essentially was when the first explorers came here, they couldn't speak any of the First Nations languages. They thought these people couldn't think, and they continue with European superiority when you sit down and you start to examine, for instance, Indigenous culture, Indigenous belief. You just go through it. We understand how, in terms of the environment and biodiversity, they're way ahead of us. I think restorative justice is another one. I think we talk about two spirits is another one. When they were still two spirits in England, they were being put in jail, and in the First Nations. I think that what we really got to do, a lot of us have got to do, is to understand that there's a lot of smart people out there who have a lot of insight and a lot of culture, and we are nuts if we don't allow it to come forth.
Okay, where's our next question? Okay, so here and then up front.
I have a question for Rachel Notley. So in looking over my notes for the what you were saying about the climate leadership plan, I can't help but notice that between 2015 and 17 we had the Fort McMurray wildfires. And this morning we were talking a lot about, or there various people were talking about patience and waiting for the window to open, and other people saying, well, no, you've got to get the window open yourself, you need to do that. To what extent did the Fort McMurray wildfires open a window that you had started opening in 2015? Were you able to, did the fires leverage, did the fires help your case?
I would say no. First of all, because we had moved pretty aggressively and we'd already rolled out the CLP well before the fires. So that was in November of 2015 and the fire was in May of 2016. And I will say that there was a profound and I think deserved sensitivity amongst the people of Fort McMurray to linking the two and using the fire as leverage for an argument with respect to the CLP, given that they were already suffering as a result of the drop in oil prices. They had already started to confound the CLP with the hardship that they were feeling as a result of the oil price drop. To then link the CLP with the fire would have it would have been hurtful, for lack of a better term. It would have been profoundly insensitive to the experience of the folks in that community, both with the economic struggles that they were going through, what that meant in their personal lives, and then the tremendous trauma that many people experience trying to race out of that city. And you and I just talked about how there really was just one road, and people were packed into their vehicles watching the flames approach them as they were stuck in a traffic jam on the one road with their kids. And it was a very traumatizing event. So it was not that. Now I will say, interestingly, June 1st was when the Jason Kenney government eliminated the carbon tax. And they had planned to have a big, of 2019, and they had planned to do massive amounts of media around it. What ended up happening was, in fact, in Alberta, there was a bigger burn this summer in 2019 than in 2016, even with the Fort McMurray fire. And on June 1st, the smoke from that burn came into Edmonton, such that at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, street lights went on because it was so dark and nobody could walk outside without a mask on. And so, not surprisingly, the UCP had to cancel their big no carbon tax celebration because Mother Nature had decided that she had wanted some time on that stage, and she had something to say. And so it was never reorganized. So I think at that point, because people's houses weren't in jeopardy, and that it was possible at that point for people to have that conversation, and they did have that conversation in June of 2019, but they didn't in 2016. It would have been really problematic. But I will say, on the matter of adaptation, which I know people have been talking about here in other sectors, that we have a real problem across this country in terms of a very dry forest. This problem's not going away. And we have a profound need to act very quickly on adaptation and mitigation efforts with or without getting carbon pricing in place tomorrow.
Melcap.
I'd like to hear both of you on when it's advantageous to have a high-profile crisis to mobilize government and the public, and when it's better to do things under the radar. And I'm thinking actually of 20 years ago and the CPP reform. You doubled payroll taxes, and nobody noticed.
Yeah.
Nice job.
Hold on, maybe we still don't know.
I suffer one huge disadvantage up here, Rachel, which you do not have. There are two people sitting in front of us who know more, have forgotten more than I know. One of them is Melcap, and the other one is Erwin Collar. And you have no idea that the pressure I have felt saying, please don't let them ask a question. I think that certainly in the international field, nothing happens without a crisis. So that if you want to get something done, just make sure that you're ready for the crisis, and then move. One of the examples is that, and although we're starting to lose it, but the whole reform in the global banking system occurred because of 2008 and the Financial Stability Forum. Now, and that does affect us domestically in our countries, the too big to fail and all of that. I would question, I almost put the question back to you and put it to Rachel. I'm not sure that certainly a crisis enables you to act domestically, no doubt about it. I would really hope, though, it wasn't as crucial as it is internationally. I would really hope that we would be able to look ahead and adjust to these things. But you've had more experience than anybody else. I almost could put the question back to you, but what do you think, Rachel?
What do you think?
You're on the panel.
Well, I mean, I think depending on the crisis, yes, there is no question that sometimes you can get more done. You can get more done on matters that link to the crisis, and sometimes you can get more done on things that have nothing to do with the crisis because no one notices. And so that is true. I would certainly suggest, though, that planning for a crisis or manufacturing a crisis is something that should be avoided at all costs, and people should be somewhat careful to observe whether that is in fact a thing that's happening as well. yes, so I think it's important that we try to be as honest as we can as politicians to address what is a real crisis and to do so in a way that is not, fanning the flames of said crisis in order to do other things. Because I think it's true, it is one strategy. But I also think that, good big ideas that are worthwhile do better if they're honestly discussed in a number of different forums and they see the light of day, and everyone can be on side with them, and they will stand the test of time if they're introduced under those better conditions.
Okay, let's have one more question to take us right to the finish line here. One more question.
Good afternoon. So you were the premier of a province and the prime minister of a country, but also a party leader of your respective political parties. So when it comes to take a public policy decision, how do you balance pleasing your electoral base and pleasing the majority overall well-being? So how do you manage to find the line?
All right. Balance the electoral base with overall well-being. Anybody want to start? It's kind of a key issue.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think the first thing that makes it easy is that if you run on a clear platform that you are proud of, that is well thought out, and that your base is also fond of, and then you run on that, it's a lovely little A plus B equals C kind of roadmap. It's when you hide from your base and try to appeal to a different group of voters, and we get in when you start playing that kind of thing. And don't get me wrong, politics is complex, and sometimes strategists will urge you to do that, and sometimes it is the right way to go, but that's where it gets very complicated, where your base is here, the vote you need to get in addition is here, and so you're trying to talk over here, and you're trying to keep your base sort of kind of out of anybody's eyesight, and that's where it starts to get you start to develop problems. In my experience, certainly even in my case, we didn't run that way, but there was a difference of opinion in our party around our position with respect to getting Trans Mountain built and moving forward on climate change. I was very privileged, quite frankly, to have a very sort of, I think, loyal and pragmatic base of members in the Alberta NDP who came along with us pretty happily. But I know it wouldn't necessarily have gone that way, and I know sort of on a national level, and the Prime Minister can talk much more about that, it is far more complicated.
So it sounds like know who you are, be who you are, and be proud of who you are.
If you can do it that way, that is without question your best way to get into government, because then it's just all, yay, we get to do the things we told the people we were going to do, and they make us happy, and they make our friends happy, and everybody's happy, and it's all good, as opposed to, oh, we have to now tell half our caucus that they're not allowed to talk about this one issue because it embarrasses us, and we've just lost this vote share over here, and then it gets a lot harder, right?
You get the last word.
Well, I with respect, is it a problem? Yeah, but I don't think it's a problem. I don't think it is a problem to that extent. But it's my own belief, and I've seen it where there are differences, that essentially that the leadership can take the issue. In fact, if it deals with the party members, they can take the issue, provided that they're prepared to sit with the party members, and they're prepared to deal with it. We've had that in the whole question of same-sex marriage was an example where the party came, but there were people who objected to that. But I don't think that I have never found that it's an issue that would actually break the party. I have found that in most instances that as long as you deal with the party openly and fairly, they will follow you.
We're going to call that a panel. So Rachel Notley, Paul Martin, thank you very much.
Thank you.